The starting point is the body, or these ideas of the body, memories of the body, and maybe an invisible body but still very much present, a speculative body. Maybe the first impression of my sculptures would be that they could be intimidating or they're big, and most of my sculptures don't have a face, for instance. So there's definitely like an element of horror in my work, and I'm fascinated by the horror in itself because I think it has always varied through history, and also what is an intimidating body and what is also projected onto a body. Also like thinking about like through like the black body and how expectations and the dehumanization of the black body throughout history, and horror also plays into it, using fear as a way to continue the dehumanization. Even when it's like experienced as something that's kind of terrifying, for me it's quite the opposite. I like saying that I'm in like a cheer for the monsters, because it's more interesting to think about how did the monster kind of get shaped to begin with. My name is Sandra Mujinga. I am a Norwegian artist, born in the DR Congo. I think my path to being an artist was my mom, because she had studied fashion. Even accessing art now, it's mainly because I tried everything else. I was like, because through drawing, I was imagining that I had to use it as like for some practical purpose. So it was never really like drawing could exist in themselves. And so, yeah, so later on I would like think I would be a graphic designer, or I'd be an architect, or I would work with like animations as a child, and then through failure coming in on those other things, I was kind of suggested I should like consider Art Academy. And when I applied to Art Academy, I got in on several. So I guess it kind of worked well. Early on when I was studying, it was before like Art Academy, like in preparatory school, I was actually exploring grief, or my works were kind of like thinking about people that were no longer here with me. And I was also thinking about the language of grief and this sort of like performance around grief, and also yeah, and how, again, these invisible bodies that they're not with you, but the traces of them are there, right? So ultimately this idea of ghosts or living with ghosts, and this was something that I was already thinking about then, and that would also appear again in my later works now. And actually, when thinking about like an invisible presence, what really made sense for me was to incorporate sound. And I think sound in itself, especially when I work with distorted sound, has this sort of presence that is continuously like, how it like can reveal itself. It's almost like a whale like appearing and then deep diving again, which I find quite beautiful. And this idea of how it can have a presence that is there all along, and through distortion it kind of like it shapeshifts, or you see a new body. So with the piece, I Build My Skin with Rocks. It is a video installation with sound, and it's kind of one of the bigger video installations that I've made. It's like a new way to think about a way for a body to hide. As my work often like investigates different strategies of hiding and being invisible, or controlling your invisibility. And so yeah, with this work I'm like imagining a body through size, a body that is like through size heights. So I envision like almost like it becomes this ultra zooming in onto a body, where through zooming there's also an abstraction. And so I'm like really thinking about a body that is a landscape, and that changes, transforms into a landscape, and through that you can't really understand where like the body starts or ends. So it's almost like this excessive body, and that becomes like a way to evade being captured or actually being truly visible. I'm very like hands-on with like, I really want to trust the process. So it's never really like, the goal in itself is not about me recreating specifically what's in my head, but it's more like a meeting with the material, that is a dialogue, and also really be truly present for all the shifts and also the glitches and frictions also that appears. And it's also really, I think, this privilege of spending time with material. So whether to be, and that happens often with the studio, so really being surrounded by something over a long period of time, which also really, that relationship is quite special, because on one hand it just starts off maybe as nothing, but you also change throughout time, and so does the material. And that's what I think is very special with studios. I've also had those moments in my studio where I'm like, I found a shape from a, trouser that I cut out, and I kind of expand it and I make it bigger, and then I repeat that shape. Why am I repeating that shape? I don't know. And I keep on like, kind of insisting on this repetition, and through that it also kind of, I guess the ideas become more clear. So I am, even when I don't have like a specific project, I create like structures where I can like, it can be also repetitive or meditative. And in that way it's also, I guess it's easier in that sense, because quite often with my sculptures, it starts off with a new skin. So I start off with like, what is this new skin that I'm going to make? And through a way to like build a new skin or work with a new skin is like, like repetition and trying out new materials. It varies a lot, like the different materials that I work with. But with, for instance, the last works that I showed that were part of like Venice Biennial, Sentinels of Change and Reworlding Remains, that was also kind of tied up to this repetitive process. And I was also trying to figure out, like really being present with the materials that I already had, and also finding a new skin or like a new texture. When I'm working with a texture, I'm also thinking about how that skin as such will meet the light, or that skin, how it will exist digitally if I film it in a video, for a video or such. So it's always like this way of like, it's always, I guess, in relation to a lens. I think a lot of works, I mean, we're always thinking about that too, whether to be like how we document our works, but also how it's documented by others too. One of the sculptures is actually a dinosaur. I was like thinking a lot about like dinosaur fossils, and also thinking about what it means to like discover, parts, bodies, or it became also like almost then in some sense thinking about the speculative body. And so I started then tearing, as I do with a lot of my sculptures. I start with the skin, and then now with this piece particularly, I wanted to use existing fabrics and tear them apart and then weave them together. And then it almost becomes like a pixelated image through like all these different fabrics being woven together. I think with my sculptures, even like with this human-like, hooded-like figures, I'm so drawn to also thinking about them as that they are also mimicking humans somehow. So they're standing like still in the dark and mimicking us in order to not be like captured. So because the green light ultimately for me also represents the dark, because it's also like interchangeable with blackness. So that, I mean, they're hiding in that sense that even when you take pictures of them now, I mean, you don't really get through the green color, you don't really get their skin. It is a way to think about surveillance and also thinking about representational politics, or thinking about this idea of what does it mean to be granted visibility when the spaces are inherently violent or did not include you to begin with. So I'm always like, yeah, there's always like this kind of contradiction, or like I'm always thinking about those sort of like, what are those moments we're celebrating somehow, and what is like, why was the space not inclusive to begin with, and if those structures at all are truly worked with before you become visible. I'm so drawn to like how time can stretch you, and I think that also appears in my sculptures, like these ideas of a body that exists outside of gravity almost, and also how it becomes like, I guess, a continuation of like not only thinking about like a speculative future time, but also thinking about like a space in itself that is also how we experience their size is not necessarily their size. But quite often I do insist on like how we experience those bodies or sculptures is like the way we are experiencing them in our world. Meanwhile, where they maybe exist in these parallel timelines, they're not as big as we perceive them. So for me, it's always like this, I'm always thinking about whose gaze is it? Is it like based on our experience of them? And I guess that's also tied up to me researching or thinking about like decentering humans as the center, and humans' view of like size and our surroundings, and everything's coming through our eyes. So I think then playing with size is quite interesting in that sense. And even with like my piece like Ghosting, which is like really, it's like it's red and it's 7 meters long, but for me, I also always imagine that it's still kind of in its world, it's invisible, while for us it's like red and big and intimidating. And I created it like almost through patching, which I also do with a lot of my sculptures. Sometimes I don't really know I don't have like a specific idea, but I think of it as bodybuilding. So I can like create like pieces and then I combine them and then put them together. It also gives this flexibility in like thinking about like which direction the body could go. So it then consists of like this kind of red patches that are almost threaded in. They're like threaded in like a tent, and it's like risen up to the ceiling, so you can actually go underneath the sculpture, and whenever you're walking around it, it's continuously changing. And it also changes depending on where it's shown. So it's very like, because it's so much, it still has this flexibility, which is also really important for me.
Sometimes I just think of you and you make me cry.
I love the way you look when you are in shock.
And I notice when you look shy, you look down.
The green screen is always like a space of potential. It's also like, yeah, it can host so many things, and it can also host our imaginations, even if it's just green. So I use green, I also use like green light as a way to almost create this overall like green screen, 360 green screen. And I think it also creates, I guess, it always made sense to think about green screen in relation to like world building. When you use like green screen and other filters and like digital editing tools, it's also kind of interesting how the body, the physical body disappears, or like how you can just continue editing and just like not really limit yourself to like the physical world. And I think it was also around that time where I was like thinking about what if I would like, for instance, if I want to like find an image of, if I'm thinking of a tree, what would be the most natural thing for me to do? Would it be that I went out and took a picture of a tree, or would it be that I Googled a tree? And I was thinking about all this different, like, I guess there's this interchangeability in how we are existing online, and also, I mean, existing digitally, and also not limiting yourself like this almost like being multiplied and being cloning yourself as such, or just existing in all these different layers, versus, I guess, this limitations of the physical world. And I think that's what green screen becomes for me.
Whatever you do it with all that you have.
I love how compassionate you are.
At the moment, it really doesn't matter how you ended up here. It is said that we tend to forget the dark.
With amnesia, the work as such is kind of this, it's very much investigating this increasing melancholic relationship to the sun. As I've had like a complicated relationship to the sun to begin with, whether it would be that I get warned at a young age that I should stay away from the sun because my skin shouldn't get darker. Yeah, thinking about the state of the planet in itself, and also how the sun is also something that's quite threatening and such. So it became like a way to think about that, and also it's activated, or it's performed by a comedian, stand-up comedian, which I thought was also interesting to like to perform it in a way as like something that's a format that's kind of recognizable, but at the same time it's also drifting away from that format. So I guess it's like the sun becomes many things, whether it would be like the light, and also here in this sense the absence of light, and also this kind of then the absence of light also becoming this melancholia.
Ultimately, I have been taught to stay away from the sun, to not become darkness itself. I didn't forget our conversation. I simply started a new timeline. I wish you followed me instead. Why do we tend to forget what is bad for us? Bad habits, they call it.
So Spectral Keepers, you enter a room and it's like green light, and then you see 4 standing figures. Like they're like human-like figures. They're made of like tall fabric, which is like layered, and then in that sense it's also working with opacity, and also kind of their skin is almost, they almost become like empty shells. I'm in different like science fiction groups and like fantasy groups online where we share like inspirations and so on. And then in one of the groups I like encountered like images of medieval beekeepers, and I was very much struck by this sort of imagery. One thing is that their faces are not visible, but it's also, I'm very much drawn to like images that look like they could be from the future, but they're from the past. So I made sort of like helmets that is almost like, so the face of the Spectral Keepers, they look like the basket, And I think with this work, it was almost like a new way to think about, like, because I'm always like thinking about strategies of hiding or creating new bodies that are invisible but are not really visible. And I think with this works, I was very much like drawn to this idea of what are those baskets capturing. So through like almost having this abstract basket, you don't really, it becomes like a third body, like a third type of body in the space. And that body is like basically what the baskets are supposed to catch. So it became a new way to like think about, like a new way to world build by like thinking about like a new creature and how this creature is shaped based on the tools that captures it. I think my entry to science fiction was like through Afrofuturism, and I think it was just, I think science fiction is also like for me a reminder that not everyone has access to their story or history, and it also becomes really this space of, instead of being discouraged around that you can also like really imagine new futures as such. So I think science fiction definitely gives this, again, I guess, like these ideas of like possibilities, or like when thinking about the future before. Sometimes a way to be with something is also through like, I guess also imagining like alternative bodies. I mean, like I think these ideas of like world building and really kind of, it gives this freedom of also trusting what you already know and what you already carry, but also kind of try to imagine other ways of being together or other ways of encountering something. And I think it's also, I guess science fiction is also, when thinking about science fiction, it's also like a way to reclaim it, because quite often there's like this trope that is so tied up to colonialism in science fiction, where you're going to an unknown place and you meet something or someone or otherness that doesn't look like you, and then you're trying, it's like, if you at all like read about all this different like colonial histories, and then it's like it makes, there's so many links towards it. And I think then science fiction can be a space to, I mean, a way to reclaim it is like thinking about alternative histories and that is not through like the lens of colonialism. And it's also thinking about just what, I guess, histories and what would have happened if certain histories did not happen also. Like there's always like a possibility to think of other ways of being together, other like economical models or other family structures, and I think science fiction can give space for that. I think art can open doors for you to be truly yourself, right? You can be like truly yourself in like 2 minutes or something, where you just have this unexpected encounter with something, with an artwork that makes you think about something or feel something that you didn't really have space for. So art gives space for many, can give space for that.